Welcome to today's event at this year's Swindon Festival of Literature, coronavirus affected Swindon Festival actually. And many thanks for joining us. We do hope that everything is fine where you are. Now, we're both pleased and grateful that human ingenuity, cutting edge science and digital technology make it possible for this show to go on, well, at least online. Today's guest author has written a book with two other writers, which focuses on the consoling power and inspiring worth of nature in a time of coronavirus, a time we have all been living through. Today's guest interviewer loves a good read and a good dose of nature, and this book, he is likely to have found both. Please join me in giving a Swindon Festival of Literature welcome to guest interviewer Mike Pringle and our guest author and leading nature writer, Michael McCarthy. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's very nice that you're both here and you can join us, although you're not actually joining us physically. I'm in Swindon, but I don't know where you are. And Swindon in spring is really very nice. Have either of you been to Swindon in spring or at any other time?
Well, my connection to it is that my wife trained in Swindon as a journalist. On the Swindon evening paper, my personal connection, I'm afraid, is only to have driven past it on the way to see the fritillaries in the meadows at Lechley.
Well, I can probably trump that here, insofar as I actually live in Swindon, and I look after a museum dedicated to Richard Jefferies, a nature writer, and I only mention him because, in actual fact, he also learned his trade at the Swindon Advertiser, the evening newspaper, as did your wife. So a strange connection there.
Oh, that's a lovely connection. And I'm 2 miles from the fritillaries where I live. So I can picture where you've been, Michael. Okay, we could go on chatting like this about how lovely Swindon is for a long time, but we're not. We're going to talk about this book, Michael McCarthy's The Consolation of Nature, Spring in the Time of Coronavirus. And it's actually co-authored with Jeremy Minot and Peter Maron. But today, Michael McCarthy is here, and in a manner of speaking, representing them. So, Mike Pringle, Michael McCarthy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Matt. Michael, there's all sorts of things that I would like to ask about this book, but I think maybe the first and most important thing is just to hand it over to you, really, and ask you if you'd tell us a bit more about it.
Thanks, Mike. Just a year ago now, two enormous events were taking place in Britain. One was that the coronavirus was beginning its what you might call its deadly rampage through the population. And the other was that spring was beginning. And the remarkable conjunction of these two happenings, one tragic, one in essence joyful, produced a season which, to employ that much misused word, was unique. A springtime with powerful implications for the value of the natural world. And I myself, and as has been said, two naturalist friends, Jeremy Minot and Peter Maron, decided we would create a memorial to it in a book. I should say at once that we were all three very aware of just how sensitive and difficult a matter it is to say positive things about an outbreak of disease which has caused so much suffering, with nearly 3 million deaths around the world, and of course, nearly 130,000 deaths here in Britain. This is a saga of heartbreak unparalleled since the Second World War. And some might take a view that it's inappropriate to look for the upsides of such a situation. Yet it is clear that upsides there have been, the most notable, of course, being the devotion and the selflessness of the NHS staff who've coped with the crisis and saved so many lives. And it is undoubtedly also the case that at the height of the pandemic's first phase, a very large number of people sought and found solace from the stress of it in the natural world, which is the key fact behind our book. which, as Mike has said and Matt has said, is the consolation of nature, spring in the time of coronavirus, and there it is. The book is a joint nature diary with an entry by at least one of us for every day from March the 21st, 2020, the spring equinox and the beginning of the astronomical spring, to the end of the meteorological spring on the 31st of May. We chose this period because these 10 weeks hold the vast majority of the wondrous transformations in the natural world in this most dynamic of seasons. And it turned out to correspond almost exactly to the first British lockdown mandated by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson as the principal method of trying to control the pandemic back then, when vaccination seemed a very distant possibility. Jeremy, Peter and I represented a geographical spread. We wrote from 3 widely separated locations, myself from Richmond upon Thames in the southwest suburbs of London, Jeremy from the village of Little Thurlow in the countryside of West Suffolk, and Peter from the village of Ramsbury in the valley of the River Kennet in the chalk downland of Wiltshire. And we covered a wide range of taxa and topics, from swallows and swifts to bluebells and brimstones, from musk roses to mining bees, and from the imagination of George Eliot and the verse of Robert Herrick to the ventriloquial abilities of the grasshopper warbler. Our book was published by Hodder in October and was fairly well received. It was chosen by The Guardian as one of their nature books of the year, and it has been shortlisted for the Richard Jefferies Prize for Nature Writing. We were prompted to undertake it for a number of reasons. For a start, as naturalists, amateur in the case of me and Jeremy professional in the case of Peter, all 3 of us enjoy anyway recording the progress of spring in detail, noting the first appearance of plants, insects and birds. But it was clear that there had never been a spring like this one, spring in the time of coronavirus. For one thing, it was the sunniest spring ever recorded in Britain, with more hours of sunshine than any previous springtime, and indeed with more sunshine than any previous British summer, apart from 3. But for another, by unfolding in parallel with the disease, it was producing a sort of bizarre and tragic incongruity. Our beloved summer migrant birds, the swallows and the cuckoos, the swifts and the willow warblers, were returning from their winter in Africa. The spring butterflies, the brimstones, the orange tips and the holly blues were emerging with their flashes of brilliance, and the spring flowers, the celandines, the primroses, the lady smocks and the bluebells were each day adding new colour to the landscape, which was only intensified by the sunshine, which from morning till evening seemed to pour down uninterruptedly. Yet, even as all this was happening, people were dying every day in their hundreds from the virus, often away from their loved ones and in distress. And not a few of the health workers and care workers who were trying to save them were also dying, while millions of others were struggling to cope with the loss of jobs and the stress of being confined to their homes, especially if home was a small flat. You almost felt that nature should have switched off out of sympathy, yet nature went blithely forward, as nature has always done. And in this time of distress and anxiety, on a scale that was unprecedented, people turned to the natural world for comfort and relief in remarkable numbers. So why did they do it? When the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew closed for the lockdown, the director, Richard Deverell, said in a statement expressing his regret and sadness at the closure, "There is no salve like nature for an anxious mind." We have long thought this as a society, though in an instinctive, generalized, sometimes slightly patronizing sort of way. Of course, a walk in the park will do you good, like a nice cup of tea. But in recent decades, we have begun to understand that the beneficial effects of exposure to the natural world on our physical and mental health are actually empirically real and can be seen as such even in a modern world which demands scientific evidence. The insight, which was the breakthrough in this, came in 1984 with the publication of a study in the journal Science by Roger Ulrich with the title of "Staggering Banality and Revolutionary Implications: View Through a Window May Influence Recovery from Surgery." Ulrich was an American architect who specialized in hospital design. And in a hospital in Pennsylvania, he had discovered something uncanny. Patients who underwent gallbladder surgery over a period of 9 years made substantially quicker and better recoveries if they had a natural view from their beds. Some of the windows of the hospital wing looked out onto a group of trees and some onto a brick wall. And those lucky enough to have the tree view, Ulrich found, recovered faster, spent less time in hospital, required fewer painkillers, had better evaluations from nurses, and experienced fewer post-operative complications than those who only had the wall to look at. The data were indisputable. They showed that contact with nature, even if only visual, clearly had a measurable effect on people's well-being. Ulrich's paper is still not widely known by the public at large, but in highlighting the reality of our organic bond with nature, it seems more of a milestone in human affairs with every year that passes. And since its publication, research has mushroomed into the effects of exposure to the natural world on our physical and especially our mental health. And there is now a vast literature. Such exposure is increasingly part of clinical practice, and recently a stream of books in Britain have borne witness to its effects, such as Bird Therapy by Joe Hartness, The Natural Health Service by Isabel Hardman, and Losing Eden by Lucy Jones. What all these accounts have in common is the belief that contact with the natural world reduces stress. And with the whole population confined to home, stress was one of the pandemic's principal consequences. We know anecdotally that people in lockdown turn to the natural world, from news items, conversations with friends, letters to the papers, and so forth. But we also have some remarkable statistics to show that the phenomenon was real and extensive. Let us take just one astonishing figure. The increase in page views for the webcams run by the wildlife trusts, the 46 trusts which look after nature on a county-by-county basis across Britain. Many people enjoy watching wildlife via webcams, which often show surprising and intimate moments in the burrow or at the nest. And in the period March the 23rd to May the 31st, 2019, there were 20,407 page views of the Trust's webcams. But in the period March the 23rd to March the 31st, 2020, the period of the first British lockdown, which corresponds almost precisely to the period covered by our book, the number of views was 433,632. That is an increase of more than 2,000%. The idea of the consolation which nature can provide was the principal motivation behind our book. But with numbers such as these, it gradually became apparent that the circumstances of the pandemic were providing another less obvious, but even deeper illustration of the value of nature to our lives. It was staring you in the face, but it was so simple, so obvious that you were likely to miss it. It was the fact that it was there. The natural world was available to us, even at such a traumatic time. It had not been thrown off course. It had not been knocked out by the pandemic, by this great world historical event, which was knocking everything else out, which was making 2020 a lost year in human affairs. At this time of chaos in the world of people, nature was a constant, as it has always been. The COVID-19 virus had wrecked, if only temporarily, so many human artifacts. It had stopped business, trade, travel, sport, education, entertainment, social gatherings of all kinds, but it hadn't stopped the spring. In nature, 2020 was not a lost year, just the opposite. And if you saw it like this, you suddenly saw once again the unique worth of the natural world, which produced us and shaped us, which holds our origins and which remains the true home of our psyches, as Roger Ulrich began to discover, and which even today, when so many have turned their backs on it, gives us everything, from the air we breathe to the water we drink and the food we eat. You saw and knew its fantastic power and resilience. You saw its infinite value. you saw the wonder of it. Jeremy and Peter and I were increasingly aware of this in our daily reporting. And for me personally, to go out and observe the spring closely at a time of such damage and hurt to human society became almost like a solemn act. It was a sort of act of faith in the natural world, in its ability to console us and to repair us and to recharge us. Most of all, in its ability simply to be there, often unrecognized and unacknowledged, but giving life to every one of us, even as human artifacts are crumbling all around. Looking back from a year on, from the vantage point of a succeeding spring, which with the virus still affecting all our lives, which we never expected a year ago, we can see that the COVID pandemic was in fact an even more remarkable event from the natural world than we three were aware of when we were observing it closely for our diary. This is because of what became known as the anthropause. That is, the great hiatus in human activity resulting from the pandemic-inspired lockdowns in many nations, which are thought to have involved nearly 4 billion people around the world. In environmental terms, the 2020 anthropause was a colossal event, one of the biggest and most significant ever to have happened to the natural world, certainly since human society began despoiling it on a large scale after World War II. It was a sort of planet-sized breathing space, with enormous drops in industrial and commercial activity and in travel, and consequently in pollution, noise, and environmental degradation. And it produced vivid instances of battered parts of the natural world prospering once more, of natural processes resuming, when pressure from the mammoth human enterprise was temporarily lessened across the globe. Fish became visible again in the canals of Venice, which were no longer churned up by tourist boats. In parts of northern India, the Himalayas became visible for the first time in 30 years as air pollution fell. Baby sea turtles made it safely to the water on Brazilian beaches because of the absence of sunbathers, joggers, and dogs. Wild boar and deer came back into car-free European cities, and in Llandudno in North Wales, wild goats roamed the streets. Some of these instances were in the nature of novelties, but others were significant. To give an example from my own experience, the historic landscape of Richmond Park in outer London was reintegrated and rewilded by the absence of the motor vehicle traffic, which had previously cut it into pieces, and no one who saw it in that April, May, and June will ever forget it. Most notable of all, the world experienced a colossal, though strictly temporary, fall in the carbon dioxide emissions, which are causing the most menacing of all our environmental problems, climate change. It is a great paradox that the pandemic, which has caused immense suffering, should give us a positive glimpse of what the world might be like if it were much less industrialized and motorized. That's one of the lessons we've learned from it, I suppose. Although the main lesson I personally took away from our enterprise of setting down a record of spring in the time of coronavirus is that the consolation of nature is a consolation like no other, and that there is something in the natural world which deep down inside us we long for, even sometimes without knowing why.
Wow. Thank you very much indeed for that, Mike. I'm not entirely sure why, but I'm not sure the camera seems to like me much. So it looks like you're going to stay center screen. But
well, I see you.
Sorry?
You're lit up on my screen.
Oh, okay. All right, then that's fair enough. You're still lit up on mine. So technology, it's all a bit beyond me. But yes, thank you very much indeed for that talk. And I mean, what really struck me about what you were saying then is you were sort of giving the meta vision, if you like, of the book. And having just read the book, and what a wonderful time to be reading it this spring, you know, sort of seeing the same things happening around me now which you were writing about a year ago. It's not quite as sunny this year as it was last year, but what really struck me is that the level of detail actually in there, which you use to tell that bigger story that you've just told. And I wonder, in your discussions about how you were going to do this with three of you approaching it, how did you tackle that right from the outset? How did you stop repeating each other, or were you always on the phone with each other, sort of discussing it as you went along? I don't know. It's fascinating. I'd love to know more.
Yeah, well, we did liaise very closely, and so we decided that we wouldn't write about the same thing. So, for example, as many of you, perhaps the audience will know, there's a very lovely spring migrant bird called the whitethroat. And because whitethroats were visible in Richmond Park, where I was patrolling, I said, I'd like to write about the whitethroat. And the others saw lots of whitethroats, but they left it to me to write about it. So we split it. We didn't want to be, the advantage I had was that my two colleagues were very experienced naturalists. Peter Maron is probably the best all-round in-depth naturalist in Britain. He's a former senior employee of the he's a trained botanist. He's got a high degrees in botany. He used to work for the Nature Conservancy Council. He's written a whole series of books, and his encyclopedic knowledge of especially of flowers and fungi and insects is quite astonishing. And Jeremy, my other coadjutor, to use the old word, is an absolutely expert bird watcher, and I am a much less skilled naturalist than either of the other two. I think I'm competent, but they are really expert. So the point was, their expertise was always available, and I suppose you might say they provided the expertise and I provided the generalizations.
Well, I think that's if you don't mind me saying, that's very modest of you. I mean, just to throwing back for a minute to a book that you wrote before, The Moth Snowstorm, which is a book I absolutely adore. But one of the things that really actually struck me about it was that link between the personal and the global, from your sort of growing up experiences on the Dee estuary to the horrific sort of destruction of these huge estuaries like the one on the Yellow Sea. And it was actually that link that really made it stick for me. And maybe this is because I'm not a naturalist. So actually that sort of level of detail and the Latin names and everything is all interesting, but it sort of goes a bit over my head. And that's a confession of my ignorance, not of their expertise. But I don't know. Do you? Is that how you sort of feel about it? Is that why you write it?
Well, I mean, the first principle of writing is not to be boring, isn't it?
Very good, yeah.
And secondly, to perhaps have a sense of the audience that you're addressing. And so, this was not a book written for a specialist naturalist audience, but the sort of presumption you would make is that somebody who would buy this book would probably have a certain amount of interest in natural history. So you could take certain things for granted. But we looked at each other's copy and we commented on each other's copy as we did it, so that, with three of you and with certainly one absolutely brilliant professional naturalist, the other two of us are unlikely to make mistakes in our natural history, and the professional naturalist has got the other two of us who are going to come down like a hawk on his infelicities of style. Not that he would be likely to make any.
Okay. So it really was sort of a team effort.
Yes, it was. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
And as a reader, what again, that this sort of idea of having three different writers, and the way you describe it, it's sort of, I can envisage it. It was like it was sort of almost like a hologram in writing sense, sort of surround sound, because you were getting these three completely different perspectives, three completely different voices, but all focused on the same sort of subject, but from a different point of view. And for some reason, that really helped me to sort of see the images that you were creating. Even though you're all saying different things, the overall impression was one that sort of I've carried around with me in my head as I've been watching nature in the real world. And I don't know, is that a sort of just an accident, a serendipitous thing, or do you?
Well, I mean, think of it this way. I mean, you can find things that are wonderful in the natural world all year round, but the spring is special, isn't it? This is the time of the return of our migrant birds, the return of our flowers. It's there in the Song of Solomon, isn't it? For lo, the winter is past, the rains are over and gone, the flowers appear on the earth, and the voice of the turtle is heard in our land. Ever since people have been writing things down, people have accepted that the spring is very special. So for a start, we're writing about the most dynamic of the seasons. So it's probably more likely to have more in it and more of interest than perhaps the winter might. So there's a lot of it. The second thing is it is a bunch of naturalists. I was going to say a bunch of experts, but Peter is definitely an expert. Jeremy is pretty much an expert. I follow very much in their footsteps, but people who know what they're talking about. Thirdly, you have the fact that this was the most beautiful spring that there's ever been in terms of recorded hours of sunshine. And fourthly, and most importantly of all, you have these terrible circumstances which are happening at the same time, which is the framing of the thing. The framing of the thing is that terrible things are happening to people while this wonderful spring is happening. And I thought from the start that this required memorializing it. I said early on that unique is a much misused word. Remember from Alan Partridge, you cannot a thing cannot be rather a thing cannot be rather unique, Mr. Partridge. A thing either is or is not unique. There are no gradations of uniqueness. But it was unique. There will never be another spring like that. And so the raw material for this book, I think, is potentially very rich. And it's not just, it's not just us being wonderful writers. You're starting anyway with very, very rich raw material. And I think it's potentially of interest to anyone with an interest in the natural world. And also, I think there's a historical interest to it as well. I do think that, people will. One of the things we had in mind is that we're not making any claims for this, but I do think in a sense, it's a historical document to have recorded this particular spring in these particular circumstances. I think people will look back and remember it and be interested.
I totally agree with that. It did. That message did come across to me even as I was reading it. I wonder now, a year on, as you said in your talk, we didn't expect to still be in the midst of COVID-ness a year later, and here we are in another spring, sort of rolling by. How does that feel now? How does that sort of, I don't know, where does that leave you a year on?
I think it took all of us by surprise, didn't it? How long the pandemic has been. It didn't take my wife by surprise, because my wife is a health professional, and she said, this is going to be 2 years and maybe 3 or 4 waves. My wife used to run the British Society for Immunology, and she knows a lot about vaccines and pandemics. And she said, we're not coming out of this as quickly as you might hope. And at the end of the first lockdown, we kind of thought, well, that was it. That's it then. And it sort of went away, and we had our summer, and then everybody went back to school and university, and it all took off again. And then in the Christmas holidays, the Kent variant just exploded. And on the 8th of January this year, there were 68,000 new cases. So I don't think we saw it coming. But I don't think the fact that it's gone on invalidates what we did. I don't think that's the case at all. I think that what we recorded was a discrete event. We recorded this spring in the time of coronavirus, and I think that was worth recording, and I think that will stand the test of time.
Yes, it was. It was, absolutely. I mean, how does this spring look now through those eyes? I mean, are you sort of? I mean, I imagine that you can always see these things around us far better than we can. But does it feel very different to last?
Well, the other chaps reckon we're about 4 or 5 days behind where we were this time last year, and they're more expert than I am. I mean, I've just been to Kew Gardens today, and it looks about the same, really. The bluebells are just starting to come into flower. The daffodils are at their peak. The magnolias are quite resplendent and stupendous even. But clearly, we had a very special weather window in the spring of 2020 with that sunshine. And, you know, you can regard that as a blessing, but you can probably make some sort of attribution of that climatic event to climate change as well. So even though it was a wonderful thing to be enjoyed, underneath there may well be a more sinister signal that the weather is changing in ways that ultimately may not be for our benefit.
No, that's a very, very good point. A sad one, but true. I mean, as you said, one of the big things that happened in last spring in the lockdown was the drop in pollution from air and road traffic and everything else goes with it. And there were huge conversations at that time. We were all enjoying the nature that we could see and the richness of it, and the animals appearing in places where you never normally see them, etc., etc. But do you think we are learning these lessons? Are we going to learn enough from this, or are we going to just drift straight back? Sorry, that's a very big question.
Well, it is a big question, and I can bore for Britain on the politics of climate change because I wrote about it for 25 years professionally. So I don't know how deeply you want to get into it, but just to say this, for the first 20 years or so of climate change, people's knowledge of climate change was based on prediction. It was what supercomputer models of the global climate said is likely to happen. In the last 10 years or so, it's gone from being based on prediction to being based on observation, for people looking out of their windows and actually seeing things happen. I mean, if you look at the Australian wildfire season a year ago, I mean, the apocalyptic pictures that appeared of kangaroos hopping through walls of flame, something's going wrong, isn't it? I mean, you don't have to be a climatologist to say that. And you know, if you look at what's happening in Australia now with the heaviest rains they've ever had, you know, and you know, heavy rainfall is a sign of a changing climate because a warming atmosphere holds more moisture. So yeah, the spring last year, which was a wonderful in terms of its sunshine, may also, I do not know, but may also in its own way be a signal of a changing climate. And of course, it is a climate whose change will not in the end benefit us, just the opposite.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, the other angle actually that was very different from yourself and your two co-authors is that they were much more out in the country than you were. You were obviously in Richmond, much more of an urban situation where that sort of drop in population was probably in pollution was probably even more apparent. But then the tragedy of being locked out of Kew, so you couldn't go and see the bluebells last year. Will you get to see them this year? Well, I know you've said you've already seen them on their way.
They've started to flower, but they'll be at their peak. If anybody wants to go to Kew, it'd be too late, won't it? Because you'll be hearing this about the 9th of May, I think.
Yes, good point.
And the bluebells in Kew will just have finished then. So I can't really recommend it to you because it'll be too late.
No. Well, fair enough. Well, I thank you very, very much for that, Michael. That's been great chatting to you, and I think I could probably bore you with questions. So I think maybe we'll probably have to draw it to a close there.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, I've sat here enthralled. I thought I'd go and make another cup of tea, but no chance. Michael, you say the first rule of good writing is not to be boring. Great quote for a literature festival. Well, the first rule of good talking is not to be boring. And I wasn't bored and I couldn't make another cup of tea. I want to get in, and as festival organizer, I'm going to say we are extending for at least 5 minutes. So gentlemen, prepare yourselves. And bearing in mind that this is the first event other than the dawn chorus, which we start the festival with, we go outside at 5:30 in the morning, 5:33 sunrise time. We just go there in preparation and hear the bird song. And then we watch the sun rise over Swindon. That's the way the festival starts. And then the first event after that is Michael McCarthy with his book, Consolation of Nature. So we're making it a little bit longer than all the other events that follow. And I want to address something to do with a friend of mine who has gone to live in the Southern Hemisphere. I won't name the place and I won't name the continent, but he gets a constant temperature there. He likes warmth. And he said, I'm going, and he's kind of nearing retiring age, and he's a bit cocky the way he says it, leaving England behind. And do you know what? Barely 2 years in, this is what he says. Matt, you're so bloody lucky. And I say, why? And he said, you've got signs of permanence all around you, stone walls, and signs of change every year, spring. And I think absolutely. I mean, aren't we amazed? Aren't we lucky to live in this country, which has these beautiful changes?
Well, that's the advantage of living in the temperate part of the world, isn't it? That we have the biggest differences, and we have this wonderful thing about spring, which is annual rebirth, because our lives are linear. They only go in one direction, and we know what's at the end. But the life of the earth is circular, and everything dies in the autumn, and everything goes frozen solid. But then everything's reborn, and that's one of the greatest things in our lives, I think.
It really is, and we had two authors earlier today who were talking about people dying from coronavirus, and most people want to go on living. It's a real problem, this mortality that we have. I want to ask you about something else you said, and I want to compliment you, but not flatter you. You're so right for a literature festival. Not a single infelicity of English. Beautiful, beautiful quotations. You say, nature, the true home of our psyche. You know, people often like to say stardust. We are stardust. And we understand
that was Joni Mitchell, wasn't it?
She sings, we are stardust. We are stardust. But now that I hear you say how the true home of our psyche is nature, it suddenly feels much closer. I can't touch stardust, but I can go into nature. There's the solace, isn't it?
Well, I wrote a book about that, which Mike has referred to, which is called The Moth Snowstorm, Nature and Joy. And that is about our bond with nature and about the fact that the natural world is our home, where we belong, where we long to go back to. And so, yes, I agree with you, and I am in sympathy entirely with your thoughts.
And but there is a balance to be struck, isn't there? A German writer, Annette von Droste-Hülshoff, 100 or more years ago, said, if you lie down on the grass, you'll realize how awful nature is. Meaning you get bitten and nibbled and all those things. So it is understandable that people like very clean homes and keep those creatures out. What do you say to that?
Well, I would say something that was first pointed out to me by Mark Avery, a good friend of mine, when he was director of conservation for the RSPB. He said the single best thing you can have for nature is scruffiness. Nature loves scruffy places. Nature doesn't like neatly trimmed lawns. Not a lot happens there. But when you've got scruffiness, lots of things happen. And the other thing you were mentioning about, nature being dangerous and uncomfortable. In the book that Mike mentioned, which I wrote about, the Moth Snowstorm, Nature and Joy, I'm very much aware of that. Nature's not paradise. Nature can kill you. Nature has dangers, But the point is, there are dangers, and they belong to us, and they're dangers which we have evolved to be. We have evolved alongside, and we are familiar with them. So nature as a package is something that we are at ease with, whereas a lot of the parts of modern life, like traffic or central heating or air travel, we haven't got 500,000 years of adaptation to those things in us. And so ultimately, they're potential sources of stress. Why nature is a reliever of stress is because we have adapted to it over many thousands of generations. And in the end, it's the place that we know best and the place where we can go to be at peace.
Absolutely. Michael, thank you very much. And I think we'd like to have you live in Swindon sometime when this is over. And the place that Mike Pringle looks after, the home of Richard Jefferies, is a tremendous place to visit. So I think we should have an event. What do you think of this, Mike?
Yes.
An event with Michael on spring.
Yes, yes.
Well, no, perhaps, as I say, perhaps with my fellow authors, which would be very nice.
That would be lovely.
You know, I am obliged, I think, to make the point that, you know, you've referred to me all the way through, and I understand that. But this was a joint production with Jeremy and Peter, and they are the authors of this as much as I am, and that needs to be said.
Yeah, and I mentioned them at the start, and they are in the programme as well. So yeah, they're mentioned. You were going to say, Mike?
I was going to say, yes, it would be lovely for you to all come down and visit the museum, which is very, very rich in daffodils at the moment, as you can imagine. Also, if mentioning Richard Jefferies, it is worth mentioning that not only was the Moth Snowstorm nominated for the Richard Jefferies, shortlisted for the Nature Writing Prize, but this book is as well for all three of you. So I'm not on the judging panel, so I have no, so I can still say yes, come on. Yeah, so we'll see later in May what the result of that is. But thanks again, Michael.
When are you announcing the winner?
I think it's later in May. I think it's 24th or something like that, off the top of my head. But.
Okay, and this will be viewed on the 3rd of May, and a couple of days later, Mike Pringle himself, Dr. Mike Pringle, will be talking about Richard Jefferies and a new book out on him. So he's part of the festival as well, not as interviewer, but presenting. This is a festival of literature. I'd like to end with a couple of bits of literature that have stood the test of time. T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland said, "April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain." But Robert Browning saw it quite another way. "Oh, to be in England, now that April's there, and whoever wakes in England sees some morning unaware that the lowest boughs and the brushwood sheaf round the elm tree bole are in tiny leaf, while the chaffinch sings on the orchard bough. In England.
In England now."
Michael, I send that to my friend in the Southern Hemisphere. Mike Pringle, interviewer, thank you very much from the Swindon Festival of Literature. And most of all, Michael McCarthy, for bringing your book to our festival. The Swindon Festival of Literature says, thank you very much.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you for having me. And I'm sure my two colleagues would say the same, Jeremy and Peter. Thank you.